Hello, welcome to Staying Global While Staying Home. My name is Lucy NewComm. I'm the CEO of the NewComm Global Group, specializing in global business from the inside out. And I'm also the host of our monthly webcast here. It's my great pleasure to have Dr. Deborah Elms with us today, the Executive Director and founder of the Asian Trade Center in Singapore. I guess it's good morning, Deborah. How are you?
Good, thank you very much.
Well, let me just tell you a little bit about Deborah before we start our conversation. Dr. Deborah Elms is the founder and executive director, as I mentioned, of the Asian Trade Center, and she is also the vice chair of the advisory board for the Asia Business Trade Association. And she's co-chair of the Trade Policy Committee of the Global Trade Professionals Alliance and a senior fellow at the Singapore Ministry of Trade and Industries Trade Academy. She received her PhD in political science from the University of Washington, her MA in international relations from the University of Southern California, and her bachelor's degree from Boston University. Deborah, thanks so much for joining us. It's a busy schedule for you, and I really appreciate your being here.
Thanks.
Why don't we take a moment to talk a little bit about the Asian Trade Center, what made you found it or find it? No, I'm teasing, found it. And what's up now these days? Where's your work headed?
Thanks. It's a great question, and I don't get asked it very often, so I'm happy to talk about it. I originally came to Singapore in 2005. An ad in The Economist magazine. I thought, why not? It could be interesting, and so I started at a local university here as a professor. And about a year into that, had an opportunity to work with the Temasek Foundation, which was a brand new foundation in Singapore funded with sovereign wealth money, and they were looking for something to do. Like, what should they do as their first philanthropic activity? And I said, one of the challenges that we have in Asia is we have lots of trade activities, but we have very poorly trained trade officials. So the individuals themselves who go and engage in this are often unclear about what they're negotiating over, or what the rules are, or what the opportunities are. And so I said, why don't we start training up trade officials from around the region to better engage on trade, especially for developing countries who have inconsistent capacity. So I started the Temasek Foundation Center for Trade and Negotiations and ran that for about 8.5 years. And I realized that another big gap in the market was that these trade officials in Asia especially have no business connections whatsoever. So they've never been in business, they've never run a business, They rarely talk to business. So they're making trade agreements designed for use by business with no input from business. So I thought, this is crazy. We should have more business engagement. And for a whole variety of reasons, that was not possible in my previous job. So I thought, well, that's silly. We should have such a thing. We should have a government and business come together, talk about trade. So I left in 2014 and started the Asian Trade Center to be a sort of bridge between companies and governments around trade and trade policy. And since then, we have done a lot of different things. But the couple of areas of focus in particular for us is on using trade agreements, so helping companies understand how to use a trade agreement, how to leverage the benefits, what can we do with it, what does it allow us to do, how can we save money, how can we find new markets. So a lot of that sort of corporate advisory work, but also providing business input to governments, useful as they're negotiating different new trade agreements. And then increasingly for us, two things are taking a lot of our time: digital trade, and understanding appropriate and inappropriate digital trade rules and trying to get those in place in different locations. And then also these new trade agreements and working with governments around the region to understand benefits of trade deals, what happens if we get different members. So a lot of projects that are government funded for us in the research side around trade in general, could be with ASEAN, could be with these larger trade agreements. And so those are the kinds of things that we've been working on recently.
Sounds exciting. You really have your finger on the pulse while you're kind of making the pulse at the same time.
I mean, it's a very, as a job, I'm not going to find another one like it, because every day is different. The opportunity to interact with an incredibly diverse range of people, from small companies to large companies, from developing economies to advanced industrialized economies, international organizations. I mean, it's been fantastic in that sense. And then to try to bring together conversations or ideas from very disparate sources and then communicate that in a way that makes sense to a different audience. So taking, what a particular business might say in very business language, and then translating that for a government official so they understand it, and the reverse, I find personally very fascinating and always challenging.
Well, yeah, I mean, one doesn't stand still much, right? I mean, what's amazing to me as you're talking is I got to know your work by reading some of your amazing analytical documents. A lot of your reports have really great analysis and data, and I have immense respect for you and your work from those. So it's kind of hard for me to imagine, and this is probably a separate conversation, the dynamic of being out in the market and creating these dynamics and being a bridge and all of that by bilateral, multilateral activity, and then sitting down and somehow having the calm and presence to sit down and really dive very deep as you do. You and I have beefs with people who are not specific enough in their comments, and your documents are very specific. So that's I would think, an interesting balance of work styles.
Sometimes it's challenging. I think what helps me is sort of two things. One is that I'm very fast. So I'm able to turn around something much more quickly than other people. If I took a week or two to think about 1,000-word piece, then I would be dead in the water. But for me, 1,000 words, I usually get that done before breakfast. And so then I can move on and do other things. So my own speed is helpful. But the second thing that matters tremendously, and especially as our workload has increased so much, is my staff are phenomenal. So I have a really interesting, young, diverse staff backed up by experts who are global. And that allows us to do lots of things that I certainly couldn't do on my own. So it's not just me, it's me plus my staff who are, again, really hard at work. And under COVID, when we are remote working because of the rules here in Singapore, we have actually gone with remote hiring as well. And so my staff have become, they've always been international, but now they're even more international and global because they could be located anywhere. And that has allowed us to really find excellent staff with experience and expertise who can write beautifully and so forth. And I think that's been very helpful.
Well, clearly you have optimized the center in Asian Trade Center. As you say, not just you, but really creating the best of the center modality and making that work in so many ways, so that, because I would imagine you're the one that's kind of out and about with these bilateral exchanges.
Yes. I mean, I do a lot more of the meetings, obviously, and a lot more client facing and government facing work. When we were back in the office, what I liked about being in the office was my staff then could participate in some of those discussions. So we would have different, it could be government officials, it could be ministers, it could be government business leaders who would come in and we'd have conversations, or we would have an event or whatever, and then my staff could interact with them. One of the downsides for me of COVID and the remote work is they have fewer opportunities to have the sort of learning that goes along with those kinds of meetings. So for me, that's the downside of COVID. But the upside of COVID is that I can source staff globally, including interns. So my interns have always been international, but now because of remote working, I'm getting interns that are literally global, and some of them are incredible.
I'm so happy for you and for them, because they'll learn a lot from you in a different way. I mean, the exposure you mentioned, of course, would be amazing, but they'll learn a lot in a different way. And certainly the resilience and the ingenuity that I imagine you and your team are extending to these days, that'll be valuable. Hopefully not in another pandemic, but just that ability to really master conditions. That's a skill set that not many people will have had other than working with groups like yours.
I think hiring is always a challenge because what we do is very specialized. And so to find someone who does trade, and particularly to find someone who does trade at the salary that I can afford, there's sort of a gap there, is difficult. So I have to train up a lot of individuals, and that can be challenging for individuals because they have to actually have the interest and the knowledge and the ability to participate. but also the speed with which we work is something that we find not that many candidates actually can handle, because
Yes.
we do not have the luxury of time in any of the projects that we're running. All of them are short. For some reason, I don't know, maybe this is just an unfortunate model, maybe it's the world that we live in, I don't know, but all of our contracts are short term, or tend to be short term. So, sort of deliver this piece of work, maximum amount of time is a year. Many of them are, you have 6 weeks, you have 8 weeks. And so you have to be able to turn things around quickly. You have to be able to pivot between projects. One of the biggest differences for me from coming from an academic background to running this business is, as an academic, you could sit in your office for a year and think about what you might possibly write in a book that you're thinking about writing before you even put anything on paper. I mean, you have a whole year or more. It depends on where you are as an academic, but like that calendar for us, we would be dead in the water. We
Right.
have to have stuff, that content that gets turned around in a hurry. And that is again, sort of skill set that not every candidate has.
I get that very well. Here in Silicon Valley, it's exactly the same. In fact, one of the big adjustments to many of us starting here was I have had to explain to staff and colleagues, the number one driver here is fast, not best. And that, for those of us who have a quality orientation, and by the way, that doesn't mean sloppy, it just means done fast. Right. And, time to market, always key. All those, accelerating, collapsing any kind of cycle. So I really understand what you're saying. And I'm probably talking fast because all of us end up doing that.
Yeah, I mean, time is money. It really is. And so, when you have a limited amount of time in a day and a lot of projects to juggle, you have to be able to deliver things quickly, and you have to do it, fingers crossed, with minimum amount of mistakes and reworking. Because if you end up with people, for example, who don't write very well, that's actually problematic for us, because then it takes more time to edit something that was poorly written in the first place than if I find someone who writes well. And so, it's interesting. I like it. I thrive, as clearly, I guess, on a bit of chaos and a bit of change. I could not have the same job every day. That would drive me nuts. But it is rare, I think, to find people who can do this and can sustain it for so long. Now, one of the other challenges we're having in COVID, as long as we're talking about staying from home, is sustaining it over so many months of working from home. I think that is challenging. I mean, it's challenging even for me, where there are days where I get up and I think I just can't face another Monday in my dining room. I've been there, done that, can't do it again. So for my staff to be able to maintain the sort of level of output week after week, month after month, and now increasingly year after year, I think is hard, and a testament to their ability, I guess.
Well, and I was thinking a testament to your leadership and the opportunities that you offer too. That's important.
I mean, we lose staff because, we cycle through individuals who just, can't, for whatever reason, can't, won't, don't want to. But the team that I have in place now is really very good. And I think that makes a big difference, because otherwise there's no way that I could deliver the volume and the output of what we're doing without having a team behind me that actually delivers consistently.
How wonderful. I'm happy for you. Like you said, it's not easy to find and to build, and it's like building and running and delivering all at the same time. So it's very Silicon Valley-esque. It's interesting. I'm glad it's working for you. Well, let's, and especially under the duress of COVID. So let's take a step towards that segue into the COVID conversation, because you've mentioned it several times. And of course, as you know, this is a webcast by and for global business professionals on navigating. And so you've touched on that. Let's take a broad, long view for a second and just talk about what you have observed kind of from an aerial view in ASEAN or, related regional areas in terms of how businesses in particular, that side of your equation, and organizations are handling COVID. What has been successful at a very broad level? What have we been learning there?
So I would say COVID has been a real challenge in Asia because we have been locked down in ways that is hard to fathom for especially an American audience. You know, the US thinks that you have sacrificed freedom, but I can tell you that you have not had the same restrictions that we have had, for example, here in Singapore. Since March of 2020, we have essentially been out of the office for almost all businesses. We have had very little retail and foot traffic. We've had zero travel until very recently, where we are finally now allowing some visitors back in, but quarantine, either home quarantine or hotel quarantine. You know, the testing, regular routine testing, mask wearing at all times in all locations. I'm not wearing one now because I'm in my house, but if I had an office, I would have to be masked up, even if it's just me in my own private office. So, you know, the restrictions are intense, and that has created real problems for companies because they are trying to carry rental costs, which are very high, buildings that they cannot use or they cannot use to their originally intended purposes. Right. They are trying to carry staff costs because you're trying not to lay off people. You don't know how long this will be, and at some point you're going to want your staff back again. You're trying to manage a remote workforce for a lot of businesses, and the disruptions are continuous. So depending on what kind of sector you're in, you know, you may find that you're able to operate in one location or one place for an extended period of time, but then suddenly the rules will change in that particular location and you can no longer work there. You have to either close or you have to have very difficult, challenging conditions. So I think it's been, for Asia-based companies, COVID has been no joke. It's not so much because we've had a lot of cases in the region. It's not the cases that are the issue. It's the sort of lockdowns that have been an issue. And the net result of that is we've lost a lot of companies, particularly in the SME sector. There have been, you know, incredible numbers of small businesses that are going under. One of the things that has helped them survive has been a lot of government money in the places that can afford that. So Singapore has really spent a crazy amount of money trying to bail out workers, the economy, et cetera, providing job support for keeping Singaporeans employed. I think that has made a difference, but it is still hard. I mean, it's been a very long time to navigate COVID. And if you are a business with cash flow issues, to make it this far is difficult. And another challenge that we have in Asia that I think is underappreciated elsewhere is the financing structures in place, especially for smaller businesses, is not the same. You can't just go to the bank and get a loan. This doesn't really exist. There's no, I can't even get it, which I find amazing. I cannot get a credit card for the company in Singapore.
Oh, really?
They don't issue corporate credit cards. I know, don't ask.
Okay.
Don't get me started on our banking.
Okay.
It's horrible. But, you know,
sorry.
I mean, to
I don't
try
mean
to
to laugh.
run it, because it's bizarre, right? Like, what are you talking about? So I think that's made an additional challenge. The resources that a business, especially smaller businesses, and this is true for most of Asia, that they have is they're limited to their own savings and their family savings, and they could potentially put up land as collateral if they needed to, but they don't have a lot. There's no sort of other ways to get financing, and that's also contributed to real problems for small businesses, especially, but increasingly also large businesses who are, you know, having to pay very high costs, again, on facilities that they generally can't use or can only use in certain ways, and keep staff. And, you know, it's just been month after month after month. It makes it harder and harder for businesses to stay in business.
I can hear that.
Yeah.
Let's drill down a little bit. You know, I think of you more working with governments, but like you've mentioned, you work on both sides. Have you noticed in that I mean, I thought, like you said, I thought we had constraints, but this is serious constraints. I know when we were chatting earlier, you mentioned only 2 people can get together at a time. So no sales pitches, maybe a sales lunch or something, coffee, I guess. But have you noticed any, the word hack is too crude, but any kind of business success stories or innovations that have made it a little bit easier, more effective?
Well, clearly we wouldn't function without Zoom. So, you know, thank heavens for Zoom. I think when we were all remote, it was a bit more manageable. when the globe was remote and everyone was sort of locked down in the sort of middle of 2020, I think it was you could manage the restrictions. You didn't like them, but you were still enthusiastic about doing what you could to keep yourself and others safe. You still said, let's pivot as much as we can online. You had a certain amount of time to make that happen. And then everything went online. I think the challenge now, and I think this is going to become acute here in Asia, is when part of the world is not remote and part of the world remains remote, then you are missing business opportunities. So if you have your competitors or your clients or whatever open for business, meeting one another regularly, flying around, they zoom in from, today I'm in Paris, like, yeah, I would love to be today in Paris.
Right.
They're zooming in from wherever they happen to be, then they have a leg up on competitors like us who can't leave our dining room, So this is a real, I think as we move, it's not just the sort of hybrid work environment inside the company, but it's also as we move to a sort of hybrid world of business, that's a real challenge, especially for Asia-based businesses where we still have very limited restrictions on your own movement, your staff movement, and travel remains so dysfunctional. That's hard. That's going to be very hard.
Yeah, well, the good news is you're a rock star, and no matter where you are. So your work distinguishes itself. You have a big leg up in that regard that, people who don't have competitive edge really suffer. But I hear you. I mean, it really is hard on the whole, as places that are opening up, still a lot of struggle around hybrid and not, I have a friend who teaches graduate school, and she says, I've told them I will do online classes or in-person classes. I will not do hybrid classes. And here's me trying to go to a conference saying, why can't they do a hybrid conference? Well, I kind of get it now after talking with her. So, I mean, we really are, the good news, for better or worse, is we're all globally figuring it out, right? That's part of the seed of this webcast. Well, before we close, I'm hesitant to bring this up after you've kindly shared how difficult it is. And I am sincerely sorry. And, the numbers in Singapore seem to be good. I mean, I'm from the outside, but so let's hope that those drive some, more open decisions. Although, as someone who comes from a market where things are still very much, some might say too open, hopefully we'll all find some middle ground and work towards something approaching normalcy in the future. Are there any silver linings that you have noticed from this time? Zoom included.
Zoom is key. I think there have been some silver linings. I mean, we've been talking about making digital transitions forever, but until you have the pandemic, a lot of companies and a lot of individuals didn't really make that commitment. And so I think moving online matters. Moving online matters for small businesses. We work with a lot, we run a trade association as well, which has both giant multinationals to work particularly on the digital policy agenda to make sure we don't have inconsistent digital policies. But we also have thousands of small businesses in the sort of small business wing of our trade association. And many of our MSMEs, those micro and small businesses, they know that they need to be digital and pivot, but they didn't really know how to do so. And I think for them, COVID has really driven home the message that you can succeed, but you have to think differently. And I think what's been heartening about the number of small businesses we work with that have not gone under is most of them have taken this opportunity to invest in their own knowledge. So they've skilled themselves up or skilled up their staff. They've gone digital. They have investigated market opportunities that they never would have thought of in the absence of a COVID. They have really pivoted their companies. They have tried they have a different attitude in general towards trying things, actually. In the past, if you were a small business, you sort of did business in one way because that's the only way that you knew. And
Right.
One of the things that I find really interesting about COVID is the extent to which small businesses are happy to experiment. Let's try something. Let's try for simple things even. Let's try changing our packaging. Let's try changing our photographs of our product. Let's change where we market. Let's change which markets we're sending advertising, for example, to. Let's think about working with different platforms or with different partners. And I think that kind of innovation is important, obviously, but it wasn't really compelling until you had COVID, and then all of a sudden you either innovated or you died. And for small businesses in Asia, especially, I think that level of innovation has been a great silver lining from this pandemic.
Yeah, it actually sounds exciting. I'm really glad to hear that. Here in
Yeah,
Silicon Valley,
some of
Oh,
it's
sorry, go
been
ahead.
great. I mean, we've had some, again, some of our small businesses have, I mean, they're still restricted and they still need the markets to recover so that they can really grow. But the fact that they are positioned better to have growth in the future, I think is very heartwarming.
That's wonderful. Do you see that sector becoming more involved with the trade agreements as a result of their innovation?
I hope so. I hope so. So, one of the things that when we do training for our small businesses, we say, you cannot be satisfied with very local, very domestic markets in most cases, because that's not going to generate the kind of returns on investment and revenue that you need to grow. So if you want to grow, we have to think bigger. And trade agreements help them structure where should I go next? What other markets should I think about? And I think for a lot of small businesses, the cost of going global is way lower than it used to be. It still could be expensive, and there's still some way too complicated, which is why we work with our governments all the time to say, let's think about policy from the perspective of small businesses. What do they need? What are the obstacles that they face? And what can we realistically address on the policy side to make it easier for small businesses to do business? And if a small business can succeed, then of course a large business can succeed. So how can we make policy fit for purpose? And that requires conversations with small businesses about what are their actual obstacles. So let me just give you one concrete example, because I'm always about concrete and practical examples.
Please.
One of the problems that small businesses face in e-commerce is returns. Right. If you are going to engage in e-commerce, you have to have returns managed well. And most customs officials in Asia, especially, are completely flummoxed by the whole concept of returns. And so the procedures are terrible for managing cross-border returns. So I have one of our small businesses makes wedding dresses. And you can imagine, as a bride, you would order wedding dresses, maybe 3 sizes, so that one of them will fit the Goldilocks principle, but you'll return the other 2. Well, this particular business owner was spending 1 day per week at customs arguing over whether or not these were imported dresses or whether these were her dresses being returned, because there's a big difference in procedure and costs of whether they're imported or they're yours. And she should not have to do that. She should not have to do that. This is a company that actually has gone global, and in fact she's relocated to the US because she's become so successful. So she's now selling her dresses directly in the US and avoiding some of this mess, because that was her biggest consumer market. But that shouldn't happen. She should be able to deliver her dresses from Asia, I think. But this customs procedure is really a problem. And so we've been trying to flag it for officials who have now started to understand, oh, this might matter. What can we do to make it better for businesses trying to manage returns? So that's the kind of practical solution, kind of practical problem that matters to companies, certainly, but that government officials were often clueless about. So they didn't really solve it because they didn't even know it was a problem.
Do you think they do now?
No, well, not all of them. I will tell you, not all of them. But I will also say that whenever we have this kind of example, or we used to, pre-COVID, she would speak, we would have, customs officials running after her to say, wait a second, let me talk to you again about what is it that the issue is? What is it that we could do? So I think that for us, that's sort of the bridge building again, critical, because you cannot get decent policies that are supportive for companies if government doesn't even understand what the issues are. So you have to have sort of both ways. You have to have the government, but you also have to have the businesses engage. And that's hard. It's hard. It's hard in Asia. I mean, the US in particular, set up for more of that engagement between business and government lobbying and activities and so forth. We don't have it in Asia. So Asian governments just are clueless about what companies do and why they do it the way they do it and what the issues are that they face. So again, that's a lot of what we do. either in the center or in our trade association or both, is try to gather those stories, try to put those individuals in front of one another wherever we can, and then try to highlight some of those issues, and then try to design policies that would make it better.
Thank you. I'm a big fan of concrete examples, and so thank you for yours. And that one is so cogent, because certainly even in the early days of the pandemic here in the US, I mean, Amazon was really struggling. And if Amazon, the behemoth that is literally Amazonic, is struggling, I mean, we would get stuff like a week late, and everybody, of course, at that time needed toilet paper, and there was a couple of key supplies that were, wanting. And it was really amazing to watch the beginning of the supply chain problem happen. Now we're at the other end of the supply chain problem happen. So I can only imagine how it was to have that kind of change foisted. It takes a while to adjust, but it sounds like between your training to help people get ahead of these problems by anticipating them, and then helping those who are reacting to unanticipated problems like returns, that slowly there'll be sort of a meeting in the middle of the future coming fast and the past catching up, to make things a little more stable going forward. I mean, these are changes that won't go away when COVID goes away, diminishes.
Yes. No, these are long-term problems, so our goal is always to just keep pushing it forward a little bit and making, advances wherever we can. And COVID has really driven, in some cases, that whole conversation way further than we would have imagined, in some cases worse. And so, we try to navigate the sort of opportunities wherever we can.
Yes, I mean, it's so interesting to have it now. We've had a year of guests, and there's a couple of common themes like the accelerated digital transformation, and more to your point about the returns and kind of the whole supply chain connection about them. Some companies have said they're doing what they thought they would be doing now as a result of COVID and the pressures of that 3 to 10 years down the road, they are doing now, and of course, not totally prepared. So, I think you give a great service in that you're probably giving a lot of confidence as well as concrete knowledge that, there is a resource in the middle of all this chaos. There's actually a resource that can help us move forward, especially the trade association, where you can have cross-pollination.
Yeah, I mean, I think this whole mentorship, which is always important, is even more vital actually now, because you need those networks of people, and you need to hear the stories of people who have been through what you're going through, or who have, cautionary tales, or who have opportunities that they can share with you. And I think another sort of silver lining for me of COVID is the willingness of individuals to engage in those networks and mentorships is higher than it's ever been that I've seen, at least, where people are, genuinely pulling together to say, what can I do to help you? And then what can you do to help me? And pushing things, in different settings. And I think that is, again, another silver lining.
I would have to agree. That's huge. I mean, that's one of the dynamics that we could use as a temperature. This COVID scenario has either pushed people into more isolated silos or brought them closer together. And I personally, I'm a big fan of, collaboration and coalition. So I think that that will be exciting, especially when you're down to 2 people per outing and things like that, to know at least there's a connected community, even if you can only go out with one other person today.
Yeah, I mean, it's been, again, the collaboration has been tough to navigate. And certainly here in Singapore, we're going to be happy when we can meet in more than just 2. Because a pair of people, as lovely as your pair might be, is not enough. You need more brains huddled together. And so we will all, I'm sure, be very happy when we finally move back to having maybe 5 people together. Like, wow, imagine that, 5 people at once. But that's the kind of thing that you need, I mean, so we've had some of it remotely, which I think is great, Zoom and so forth. But the in-person, you can't discount the importance of in-person either. But again, the sort of willingness of people to engage, I find useful and heartening. And hopefully it maintains for longer, and doesn't just sort of diminish once we sort of forget what it was like to be in COVID.
Yeah, that'll be interesting. Well, let's hope that the openness that may not have necessarily been characteristic in some of your business circles that you've mentioned, but has emerged by desperation, if not design, can somehow continue. And congratulations to the Asian Trade Center for continuing to lead, because it seems like you're definitely leading for them.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
You bet. Well, Dr. Deborah Elms of the Asian Trade Center in Singapore, thank you for joining us today and sharing very candidly and practically what's happening with COVID and how businesses and organizations are managing. And we wish you continued success, particularly sounds like patience and endurance, as well as hopefully some opening up soon.
Yes, it would be great. So thanks for the opportunity to connect. Again, I think networking is key. So connecting with other networks makes a difference for all of us.
Thank you. Looking forward to continuing that. And this is Lucy NewComm, CEO of the NewComm Global Group. We specialize in global business from the inside out, go-to-market, FDI, and leadership development training. Next month, we are actually finishing with our series here today with Deborah for the year. And then in January, we will be continuing with Zimkita Bua in South Africa. Zimkita is CEO of Quantica. And as we know, navigating the pandemic among African businesses has been an entirely different scenario. Deborah, thanks again, and wishing you the very best for continued success.
Thanks so much. It was an honor.
Bye-bye.